In 2005, Turkey applied to become a member of the European Union. The country, heir to the Ottoman Empire and the bridge between the East and the West, was in the midst of a huge economic boom. After years of extreme inflation, the Turkish economy, under the government of the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, was achieving consistent and record growth. With gains of 7% on average between 2002 and 2007, the country's economy seemed to be on track to turn Turkey into an economic powerhouse. 2 decades later, the promise has not been fully fulfilled. In 2023, even though the growth rate of the country's economy remained above 4%, people in the streets were suffering a tight economic squeeze. The cause? A rampant hyperinflation that at times kept the rates above 80%, and that is making life unaffordable for the regular people of the country. An economic storm that, as happened with other countries, was set in motion by the coronavirus pandemic, but which in the case of Turkey has worsened considerably ever since. But why is Turkey failing to turn around its struggling economy? With its 84.1 million inhabitants and its imperial past, last year Turkey was the world's 18th largest economy, with a total GDP of more than $1 trillion. A global standing that does not account for the country's troubled economic past. Because the truth is that the country is no stranger to unruly episodes of inflation. In the decades between the 70s and the early 2000s, prices in the country were constantly spiking up in bursts. In 1978, inflation was so out of control that it ended up reaching the 59% rate, a record rate never seen in the previous decade. And it was just the beginning. 2 years later, the country's inflation rate had shot up even more, reaching over a whopping 138%. In the next years, the inflation rates remained highly unstable. During the 80s, the inflation rates never fell below 24%, and it didn't take long until they were shooting up again. The country topped 85% again in 1988, 89% in 1992, and 130% in 1995. It was not until 2003 when the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, headed by the current president of the country, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, took office, that the economic measures adopted to fight inflation started to work. The measures adopted by the AKP's government proved successful, and the country's economy started to grow at an outstanding pace. The recipe of the economic leaders of the AKP party to combat inflation differed from what economic manuals suggested. According to basic macroeconomic theory, raising interest rates, or in other words, making borrowing money more expensive, is the lever to pull to lower inflation. According to the theory, the higher the cost of money, the fewer incentives people have to spend, thus forcing the companies to lower their prices and ending inflation on the way. In 2002, AKP's government did the exact opposite. After winning the elections, they set the rates into a decreasing path that lasted until 2006. In 2002, Turkey's economy, after tanking a 5.8% in 2001, achieved a growth that at 6.4% offset the losses of the previous year. The positive growth rate inaugurated a solid run for the nation's economy, and in the next 5 years, the average yearly growth rates stood above 7% consistently. It was then that the narrative about Turkey's promising economic future was built. The privileged position between the West and the East, and the decision of the government to play on very low interest rates to ensure a constant flow of foreign investment, propelled the country's economy to the global top 20. By the time the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the country's solid growth rates were strong enough to withstand the shock better than other economies. In 2008, its GDP grew by a meager 0.6%, a rate that predicted the recession that hit the country in 2009, and that caused a contraction of 4.8% of its economic output. By 2010, however, Turkey returned to the growth path, achieving an outstanding growth of 8.4% and setting the country for another successful economic run. Turkey's problems started again as a consequence of the coronavirus pandemic. The global measures adopted to fight off an economic recession fired back, and inflation became one of the worst nightmares of the developed countries. Erdogan's preference for low interest rates fires up the economy when inflation is also low. But in a perfect economic storm like the one that followed the pandemic, low interest rates contribute to propel inflation even higher. To complicate the picture further, the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine also had a pernicious effect on the Turkish economy and the world at large. The involvement of Russia, one of the main energy exporters of the European continent in the conflict, contributed to a strong spike in energy prices in 2022 that affected most EU countries and, by proximity, also Turkey. This combination of factors had a considerable impact on the Turkish economy, and by October of 2022, inflation in the country had climbed up to a whopping 85%. As such, by then, Turkish citizens were paying over 85% more for basic things than a year before. Ever since then, consumer prices have stayed high in the country, worsening once again in the first half of 2024. When the country suffered an average inflation of 69.5%. The problem with inflation is that it has an oversized impact on the lives of regular people. In an environment with high inflation, the most wealthy people have ways to curb the negative impact on their own finances. This is done by buying foreign currencies, investing abroad, or purchasing assets unaffected by inflation. The rich rarely suffer the impact of inflation. The least privileged, on the other hand, have to deal with skyrocketing prices, struggling to be able to afford the most basic products and services, and the lack of alternatives. To make matters worse, the Turkish lira has also been on a steady devaluation during the whole last decade. From the $0.46 1 lira was worth in 2014, the country's currency has tanked to the 0.019 it is worth today, a decline that has had a tremendous impact on the economic lives of the Turkish population. The problem with the Turkish lira is especially worrisome because the currency is surprisingly young. As such, the current legal currency in the country was introduced in 2005. It was created and adopted in order to replace the previous Turkish lira, a currency that had failed because of the inflationary tendencies of the economy. Today, the new lira doesn't seem to be holding up much better, and the rapid decline of its value has already been felt throughout the economy. On the one hand, the currency devaluation has made imports more costly to the citizens, while making exporting less profitable for Turkish companies. On the other hand, the troubles affecting the lira have also scared investors away from bringing their money into the country's economy. As such, foreign investment in Turkey has been in a downward spiral since 2015. In 2023, it reached $10.6 billion, almost $3.1 billion less than the 2022, thus putting an end to the success of Erdogan's economic recipe, over-reliant on foreign money. One of the obstacles that lay between Turkey and the policies the country needs to rein in inflation might have been its own government. Headed by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has been in power now for 20 years, the executive faced its last challenge in May of 2023. Then Erdogan achieved his 6th electoral victory, securing a new presidential term until 2028. Yet in 2023, for the first time, the opposition got a considerable percentage of the vote, a tendency that has since then solidified with the local elections of March 2024, in which Erdogan's party lost for the first time since the early 2000s. A ferocious defender of low interest rates, a recipe that helped him rein in inflation in the early 2000s, Erdogan has been slow in applying classic macroeconomic measures to the country's current economic problems. As such, in his electoral program for 2023, Turkey's president had once again the promise of keeping interest rates low. A promise that the executive branch broke as early as 1 month after securing another term. Then, in June 2023, the newly appointed economic leaders announced a first interest rate increment to 15%. It was the first raise since 2021, despite the stubbornly high inflation that the country has been suffering for the last 4 years. June 2024 has been the first month to offer some silver linings for the Turkish battered pockets. It was, since October 2023, the first month in which inflation fell a bit, a sign that may herald better economic times for Turkey. It will nonetheless take some time to be able to assess the real state of Turkey's economy and currency, at least according to the rector of the Topkapi University in Istanbul, Emre Alkin, who said in 2023 that the currency will only reach its true value after a period of delayed inflation. In the meantime, we will have to wait to see if the country's inflation stays in the promising trend of the last months. Then, once the lira's value is stable and prices are no longer skyrocketing, we will know whether Turkey is back on the race to keep being an economic powerhouse, or if it failed in turning its declining economy.